My parents paid for my sister's college without hesitation, but when it was my turn, they told me to figure it out myself. I worked, I struggled, and I stayed silent while they bragged about her future. They came to my graduation thinking it was just a formality. Then the dean stopped, looked up, and called my name as valedictorian, and in that moment, the truth they ignored finally stood up in front of everyone. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through quiet favoritism or felt invisible in your own family, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. Your story matters too. I don't remember a time when my sister and I were treated the same. It wasn't something anyone ever said out loud, at least not at first. It lived in small moments, in the way my parents' voices softened when they spoke to her, in the way mistakes were explained away for her but remembered forever when they were mine. My sister, Lena, was 2 years younger than me, bright and charming, the kind of child who could spill juice on the carpet and somehow make it adorable. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who learned early that praise was rare and approval came with conditions. Growing up, I told myself it didn't matter. I focused on school, on keeping my grades high, on being useful. When my parents were tired, I helped without being asked. When money was tight, I didn't complain. I thought if I did everything right, eventually they'd see me the way they saw her. But favoritism doesn't work like that. It doesn't respond to effort. It simply exists, shaping everything around it. When Lena was in high school, my parents talked endlessly about her future. College brochures piled up on the kitchen table. They discussed dorms, majors, meal plans, and internships as if it were a shared family project. I listened from the doorway, pretending not to care, pretending I didn't notice that no one asked about my plans, even though I was only a year ahead of her. When I did bring it up once, my mother smiled in a tight, distracted way and said, "We'll see. Things are expensive. You're independent. You'll figure something out." I figured it was just timing. Lena was the baby. Of course she got attention. I told myself my turn would come. It didn't. The night Lena received her acceptance letter to her dream school, my parents opened a bottle of sparkling juice and took pictures like it was a holiday. My father announced proudly that they would cover everything: tuition, housing, books. "He deserves to start his life without stress," he said, raising his glass. Everyone looked at Lena. No one looked at me. My chest felt tight, but I clapped and smiled and told her how proud I was, because that's what good sisters do. A few months later, when my own acceptance letter arrived, it was quieter. I slid it onto the table during dinner, my hands shaking just a little. My mother glanced at it, nodded once, and went back to eating. "That's good," she said. "So, what's your plan?" I waited for more, for questions, for an offer. Instead, my father cleared his throat and said, "We've already committed a lot to your sister. You're older, more capable. You can work part-time, apply for loans. It'll build character." That was the moment I understood, not because they wouldn't pay, but because they never considered paying. There was no discussion, no hesitation, no sadness in their voices. It was decided long before I opened my mouth. I nodded. I said I understood. I went to my room and sat on my bed in the dark, holding that acceptance letter like it might disappear if I let go. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream or argue. I just made a promise to myself that if I was going to do this alone, I would do it fully, quietly, successfully. College became a balancing act of exhaustion and determination. I worked mornings at a cafe, afternoons in the library, and weekends wherever I could pick up extra hours. I learned how to stretch meals, how to study on buses, how to sleep in short, efficient bursts. I never told my parents how tired I was. When they called, which wasn't often, they asked about Lena. How was her dorm? Was she making friends? Did she like her classes? I answered politely, then said I was busy and hung up. They never visited my campus. They never asked about my grades. When I mentioned an award or a scholarship I'd earned, my mother would say, "That's nice," in the same tone someone might comment on the weather. Lena, meanwhile, came home with stories of trips, internships my parents helped her secure, and worries about choosing the right major. My parents listened to her with rapt attention, offering advice, reassurance, and money whenever she needed it. There were nights I sat alone in my dorm room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was doing something wrong by not demanding more, but something in me refused to beg. I didn't want their help if it came with resentment. I didn't want love that had to be negotiated. So I kept going, one semester at a time, telling myself that success didn't need an audience. By my junior year, I had built a routine so tight there was no room for doubt. My grades were perfect, professors knew my name, opportunities came my way because I worked for them, not because anyone handed them to me. Still, at home, nothing changed. Lena's achievements were celebrated loudly, mine existed quietly, like a secret I carried alone. When graduation approached, I almost didn't invite my parents. I assumed they wouldn't come, but Lena insisted. "It's still your graduation," she said almost defensively. "They should be there." So I sent the information, expecting nothing. They decided to attend at the last minute. My mother called and said, "We'll make it work," like she was rearranging an appointment, not witnessing the end of 4 years of my life. I didn't tell them about my ranking. I didn't tell them about the honors. I didn't tell them I'd been asked to speak. Some part of me wanted the moment to exist without preparation, without expectations, without them reshaping it before it happened. On the morning of graduation, I put on my gown alone. I pinned my hair back with shaking fingers and looked at myself in the mirror, barely recognizing the person staring back. She looked older, stronger, tired but unbroken. I whispered to myself, "You did this." And for the first time, I believed it. I didn't know then how loudly the truth was about to speak for me. When I arrived at the ceremony, the campus looked different than it had on ordinary days. Everything felt slower, heavier, like the air itself understood what this moment meant. Rows of chairs stretched across the lawn, families gathering in clusters, laughter rising and falling like waves. I spotted my parents near the back, my mother adjusting her sunglasses, my father scanning the program with mild interest. Lena stood beside them, already waving when she saw me, her smile bright and familiar. I lifted my hand in a small wave back, then turned away before my chest could tighten. Sitting with my graduating class, I felt oddly calm. The nerves I expected never came. Maybe it was because by then I'd already survived the hardest parts alone. This was just the ending. Or maybe it was because a quiet certainty had settled in me, the kind that doesn't need validation. I listened as names were called, degrees announced, applause swelling and fading again. Each clap sounded distant, like rain against a window. As I waited, my mind drifted backward, replaying moments I rarely allowed myself to sit with. I remembered the winter I worked double shifts because my financial aid hadn't come through yet, the way my hands cracked from the cold as I biked to campus before sunrise. I remembered eating plain rice for days, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself it didn't matter. I remembered calling home once, exhausted and scared, only to hear my mother rush me off the phone because Lena needed help choosing between 2 elective classes. I never told them how close I came to quitting, not because I wanted praise, but because I didn't want their doubt. I learned that night that my strength came from silence, from carrying my own weight without asking for permission. It wasn't noble, it was necessary. When the dean began speaking again, his voice cut through my thoughts. He talked about resilience, about students who had overcome adversity, about excellence achieved through persistence. I listened politely, assuming the words were meant for someone else. Then he paused. the kind of pause that makes the air stretch. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at his notes. "And now," he said, "it is my honor to recognize this year's valedictorian." My heart skipped, but not for the reason it should have. I assumed it would be someone else, someone louder, someone whose success had been visible, celebrated. I barely reacted when he took another breath. Then he said my name. For a second, I didn't move. The sound felt unreal, like it belonged to another life. Around me, heads turned. Someone gasped softly. I felt a hand touch my arm, urging me forward. My legs stood before my mind caught up, and suddenly I was walking, the ground unsteady beneath my feet. Applause erupted, louder than anything I'd heard all day. It rolled over me, filled my ears, pressed against my chest. I looked out into the crowd, searching without meaning to. That's when I saw them. My mother's mouth was open, her expression frozen between surprise and disbelief. My father stared at the stage, program forgotten in his lap. Lena's hands were clasped together, her eyes wide, not smiling, not frowning, just stunned. For the first time in my life, all of them were looking at me the same way. I reached the podium and took a breath. The microphone felt cool under my fingers. I could hear my heartbeat, steady and loud, reminding me I was still here. I glanced at the dean, who smiled warmly, and then I looked out again at the sea of faces. I didn't plan my speech to make a point. I didn't plan to expose anyone, but I also didn't plan to hide. I spoke about perseverance, about unseen effort, about the quiet students who sit in the back, working jobs no one knows about, carrying responsibilities no one applauds. I talked about believing in yourself when no one else does, about learning that worth isn't measured by who invests in you financially, but by who you become when you're forced to invest in yourself. As the words left my mouth, something shifted. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I was honest, and honesty, I learned, can be louder than accusation. When I stepped down, the applause returned, but it felt different now, warmer, personal. Strangers smiled at me as I passed. A few people wiped their eyes. I sat back down, hands trembling, and stared straight ahead, afraid that if I looked at my parents again, the moment would crack open into something I couldn't control. The ceremony ended in a blur. Caps flew into the air, music swelled, people hugged and laughed and cried. I stood slowly, taking it all in, letting myself feel proud without immediately bracing for disappointment. For once, the moment belonged to me alone. My parents approached hesitantly. I could tell by the way they walked, slower than usual, uncertain. My mother reached for me first, her arm stiff, her embrace unfamiliar. "She didn't know," she said quietly, as if that explained everything. "I know," I replied. My voice was calm, not cold, just steady. My father cleared his throat. "Why didn't you tell us you were doing so well?" I met his eyes. "You never asked." The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. Lena stood beside them, her face unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't know either," she said. "I mean, I knew you worked hard, but I didn't know it was like that." I nodded. Most people didn't. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just the truth sitting between us, undeniable now. My parents murmured congratulations, pride laced awkwardly through their words. I accepted them politely, but something inside me had already shifted. Their approval felt different now, smaller, less essential. That night, alone in my room, I folded my gown carefully and placed it in the corner. I sat on my bed and let the quiet settle. I thought about the girl who opened her acceptance letter years ago, waiting for permission. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that she wouldn't need it, that her success would speak for her when she was tired of explaining herself. I realized then that the real victory wasn't the title or the applause. It was the freedom The knowledge that I could build something meaningful without being chosen first, that I could love my family without letting their limitations define me. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the invisible child, not because they finally saw me, but because I finally saw myself. The days after graduation felt strangely quiet, like the world had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Friends packed their things, campuses emptied, and life began nudging us all toward whatever came next. I stayed an extra week, tying up paperwork, saying goodbye to professors who would become anchors in my life. Each handshake, each hug felt earned in a way I couldn't fully explain. They knew my work ethic, my discipline, my consistency. They didn't know my family story, but they didn't need to. They saw the results. When I finally went home, the house felt smaller than I remembered. The walls were the same, the furniture unchanged, but I was different. I noticed it immediately in the way my parents looked at me now. Longer glances, careful words, a kind of delayed curiosity that had never been there before. My mother asked about my plans. My father asked about job offers. The questions felt new, almost awkward, like they were speaking a language they'd never practiced with me. At dinner, the first night back, Lena talked about her internship, her voice confident and animated. Normally, that would have been the end of it. But this time, my mother turned to me and asked, "And what about you? What are you thinking of doing next?" I paused, fork hovering in midair, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. "I've accepted a position," I said calmly. "It's full-time, it's in my field, and it comes with benefits." My father raised his eyebrows. "Already?" I nodded. I had to plan ahead. Something flickered across his face then. Recognition, maybe, or regret. He didn't say anything else, but he nodded slowly, as if fitting me into a new category in his mind. Later that evening, my mother knocked on my door. She stood there for a moment before speaking, her hands clasped tightly together. "I want you to know," she began, "we're proud of you." I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who raised me, fed me, taught me right from wrong, but also overlooked me in ways that still ached. "Thank you," I said. It was honest. It just wasn't everything. She hesitated. "We didn't realize how much you were carrying." I wanted to tell her that realization doesn't erase the weight, that silence doesn't mean absence of pain, but I also knew this wasn't the moment for everything. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't arrive all at once. "I know," I said instead. After she left, I sat on my bed and let the memory of the graduation replay in my mind, not the applause, but the stillness afterward. The moment I understood that validation, when it finally comes, doesn't always land the way you imagine. Sometimes it feels anticlimactic. Sometimes it arrives too late to change the past, but just in time to change how you carry it. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic in our house shifted in subtle ways. My parents asked my opinion more often. They listened longer. Lena, to her credit, made an effort too. She asked me about my work, about my experiences, about things she'd never been curious about before. There was no dramatic apology, no tearful confession, just small, careful steps towards something more balanced. One afternoon, Lena and I sat together on the porch, the sun low in the sky. She said, "I didn't know they paid for everything for me and nothing for you." Not really. I guess I didn't want to know. I appreciated her honesty more than she realized. I said, "It wasn't your fault." And I meant it. Favoritism is a system, not a single choice. She nodded. "Still, I'm sorry." That was enough. Starting my job felt like stepping into a life I'd imagined during my hardest nights. The first paycheck, modest as it was, meant more to me than any gift my parents could have offered me. It was proof. not just of my ability to succeed, but of my capacity to endure. Each day I walked into that office knowing I had built my path without shortcuts. There was pride in that. There was peace. My parents attended my small celebration dinner weeks later. They smiled, they toasted, they said all the right things. But I noticed something else too. They listened when I spoke. They didn't interrupt. They didn't redirect the conversation. It was subtle, but it mattered. I realized then that public recognition forced a mirror in front of them, not to shame them, but to show them what they had overlooked. Sometimes people don't understand the weight of their choices until the outcome stands right in front of them, undeniable and public. For me, the lesson settled slowly but firmly. I didn't need to compete with my sister. I didn't need to earn love through achievement. I didn't need to wait for fairness to begin living fully. I had already done the hardest part, believing in myself when no one else did. There are still moments when old feelings resurface, when I hear my parents brag about Lena, when memories creep in uninvited. But now they don't control me. I acknowledge them, then let them pass. I know who I am. I know what I've survived. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's the space where strength grows. And when the world finally hears your name, it's not because you demanded attention, it's because you earned it. I don't resent my parents anymore. I don't carry anger like a badge of honor. I carry clarity, and that clarity has given me something far more valuable than their approval. It's given me ownership of my own story.
As months passed, I began to notice how deeply that moment at graduation had rewired something inside me. Before, I had measured my worth by how quietly I could endure, how much I could carry without being seen. Now, I was learning a different kind of balance, one where I didn't disappear just to keep the peace. It was uncomfortable at first. Speaking up always is when you've been silent for so long. At work, I found myself volunteering ideas in meetings, even when my voice trembled slightly. I took on projects that scared me, not because I wanted to prove anything to anyone, but because I trusted myself to figure things out. That trust was new. It felt like learning how to walk again, steady but cautious, aware of every step. At home, the shift continued. My parents no longer assumed I'd adjust myself around their expectations. Instead, they asked, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes too late, but the effort was there. And effort, I'd learned, is a language of its own. One evening, my father asked me to sit with him in the living room. The television was off, the house quiet. He folded his hands in front of him, a habit he had when he was nervous. "I want to talk," he said. I waited. "When you were younger," he continued, "we thought you were strong enough to handle things on your own. You never complained. You never asked for help." I nodded slowly. I didn't feel like I could. He swallowed. "We thought we were helping you grow." I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time I saw not authority, but fallibility. "I did grow," I said, "just not the way you thought." The conversation didn't erase the past. It didn't justify it either, but it acknowledged it. And sometimes, acknowledgement is the bridge between hurt and healing. Later that night, I wrote in a journal I'd kept since college. Page after page was filled with exhaustion, determination, and quiet resolve. I added a new entry, one that felt lighter. I wrote about forgiveness, not the kind that excuses, but the kind that releases. I wasn't letting go for them, I was letting go for me. Lena and I grew closer too, in ways we never had before. Without the unspoken competition, there was room for honesty. We talked about childhood, about expectations, about how differently we'd experienced the same household. She admitted she often felt pressure to succeed because so much had been invested in her. I admitted I felt invisible because so little had been. Neither of us had chosen those roles. We had just lived inside them. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, my mother found a stack of my childhood report cards, straight A's, teacher comments praising diligence and kindness. She brought them to me, her eyes misty. "I didn't realize," she said again. The words had become familiar by then. "I know," I replied gently. What surprised me wasn't the sadness that came with that moment, it was the lack of anger. I felt a quiet acceptance, a sense that I had already grieved what I needed to grieve. The child who wanted to be seen had grown into an adult who could see herself clearly. As the year moved forward, invitations came, family gatherings, celebrations, holidays. I attended them differently now. I didn't shrink or overcompensate. I showed up as myself, whole and unafraid. When conversations drifted toward accomplishments, I spoke naturally about my work without downplaying it. When someone overlooked me, I no longer internalized it. Their blindness was no longer my burden. I began mentoring a young colleague at work, someone who reminded me painfully of my younger self, quiet, capable, overlooked. I encouraged her, advocated for her, and watched her confidence bloom. In helping her, I healed parts of myself I hadn't realized were still tender. I understood then that cycles don't break on their own. Someone has to notice them, name them, and choose differently. I had been forced into independence, but I could choose compassion. My parents never fully apologized in the way I once imagined they might. There was no grand confession or emotional reckoning, but there was change, there was growth. There was a willingness to see me now, even if they hadn't then, and I learned to accept that too. On the anniversary of my graduation, I stood alone on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about the dean calling my name, about the way the crowd had risen, about the sudden, undeniable clarity of that moment. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't triumph over others, it was alignment, my inner truth finally matching the outer world. I whispered a quiet thank you, to myself, to the version of me that didn't quit, to the one that kept going when no one was watching. She deserved that moment. She deserved everything that came after. And maybe that's the real lesson I carry forward, that even when support is uneven, love is conditional, and fairness feels distant, you can still build something beautiful, not out of bitterness, but out of belief.
Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that year, but it became clearer. The kind of clarity that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but quietly rearranges everything inside you. I stopped waiting for moments to prove my worth and started living as if it had already been proven. That shift changed how I walked into rooms, how I spoke, how I chose what to tolerate and what to release. At work, opportunities expanded, not because I chased them desperately, but because I was steady, reliable, visible. My manager trusted me with larger responsibilities, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about being trusted. I didn't shrink myself to make others comfortable. I accepted praise without deflecting it. I learned that confidence doesn't have to be loud to be real. At home, the balance continued to evolve. My parents still slipped into old patterns sometimes. My mother would gush over Lena's milestones with a little too much enthusiasm. My father would forget details I'd shared about my job. But the difference now was internal. Those moments no longer reopened old wounds. They landed, registered, and passed. I no longer measured my healing by their behavior. One evening during a family gathering, an aunt pulled me aside. "Your parents are so proud of you," she whispered. "They talk about you all the time now." I smiled politely, but inside something else surfaced. Not satisfaction, not validation, just awareness. Pride spoken behind closed doors doesn't undo silence spoken out loud. And that was okay. I didn't need it anymore. Later that night, as dishes were cleared and conversations softened, my mother sat beside me. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "if we could go back, we might do things differently." I looked at her hands folded in her lap, the same hands that had guided me through childhood. "We can't go back," I said gently, "but we can go forward better." She nodded, tears welling but not falling. In that moment, I understood something important. Regret is heavy, but responsibility is heavier. She was carrying both. My relationship with Lena deepened in unexpected ways. Without the shadow of favoritism looming between us, we found common ground. We talked about careers, relationships, fears. One afternoon, she admitted, "Sometimes I wonder who I'd be if they hadn't smoothed everything for me." Her question surprised me. "You're still figuring that out," I said, "just like everyone else." It wasn't a criticism, it was the truth. Support can be a gift, but it can also delay growth. Struggle can be painful, but it can also sharpen you. Neither path guarantees happiness, they just shape you differently. As time went on, I found myself reflecting less on what my parents hadn't done and more on what I had. I'd built resilience not because it was expected, but because it was required. I'd learned discipline not from structure, but from survival. And somewhere along the way, survival had turned into strength. I started speaking at small events, sharing my journey with students who reminded me of myself. I talked about quiet perseverance, about not waiting for permission to succeed. I never framed my story as a victory over my family. I framed it as a victory with myself. That distinction mattered. One student approached me afterward, eyes bright and nervous. "My parents don't believe in my dreams," she said softly. "Did yours?" I paused, choosing honesty over comfort. I said, "Not at first, but belief isn't always given. Sometimes it's built." That became my guiding principle. Build belief, brick by brick, day by day, even when no one is watching. On nights when doubt crept in, when old memories tried to reclaim space, I reminded myself of the dean's voice calling my name. Not because of the applause, but because of what it represented. A moment where truth didn't need defending, where effort didn't need explanation, where my story spoke for itself. I learned that closure doesn't always come as an apology. Sometimes it comes as acceptance. Sometimes it comes as peace. And sometimes it comes as standing firmly in who you've become, regardless of who failed to see you before. My parents and I are still learning each other. Healing isn't linear. It bends, loops, pauses. But there's respect now. There's listening. There's space for me to exist without justification. And that, in its own quiet way, feels like reconciliation. If I could speak to the version of myself who felt overlooked, who worked late nights and early mornings wondering if it would ever matter, I'd tell her this: it already does. Even before the recognition, even before the applause, even before anyone else understands. Because success isn't the moment your name is called, it's every moment you choose not to give up when no one is calling at all.
There was a moment, sometime in the second year of my job, when I realized how far I had truly come. It wasn't during a presentation or a performance review. It happened on an ordinary afternoon while I was sitting at my desk reviewing a report I had written. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking if I could help Lena think through a career decision. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. Years ago, that message would have stirred something sharp inside me, a familiar ache, the sense that my role was still to support quietly, to give without being asked how much it cost me. But this time, the feeling was different, calm, neutral. I replied when I was ready, not rushed, not resentful. That's when I knew the old power imbalance no longer lived inside me. Later that evening, Lena called me directly. Her voice was hesitant. "I wanted to ask you myself," she said, "not just through Mom." That mattered more than she knew. We talked for over an hour, weighing options, discussing fears, acknowledging uncertainty. She listened to me, not as the older sister who would step aside, but as someone whose experience carried weight. When we hung up, I felt something settle gently into place. Respect, not demanded, earned. Around that time, my parents began involving me in decisions they never would have before: financial planning, family logistics, even emotional conversations they once avoided. It wasn't dramatic, it was incremental, but each small inclusion felt like a quiet apology, even if the words never came. One weekend, my father and I worked together in the garage, sorting through old boxes. Dust coated everything. Memories spilled out in the form of photographs, school projects, forgotten keepsakes. He held up one of my elementary school notebooks, the corners worn soft. "You were always so organized," he said, almost to himself. I smiled faintly. I had to be. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing the meaning behind my words for the first time. "I see that now," he said quietly. Those 4 words landed heavier than any grand apology could have. I see that now. Not "I'm sorry," not "we were wrong," just acknowledgement, recognition, presence. And I realized something important in that moment. Healing doesn't always come wrapped in perfect language. Sometimes it arrives in understanding that blooms late, but still blooms. As my life continued forward, I became more intentional about how I defined success. It was no longer about titles or public moments. It was about alignment, about waking up without dread, about choosing relationships that felt reciprocal, about knowing when to give and when to step back. I began saying no more often. No to obligations rooted in guilt. No to conversations that diminished me. No to the version of myself that believed love had to be earned through exhaustion. Each no made space for something better. At family gatherings, I noticed how dynamics shifted around me. When I spoke, people listened. When I disagreed, it wasn't brushed aside. When I left early, no one questioned my reasons. It wasn't because I had become louder, it was because I had become firmer. And firmness, I learned, invites respect. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, my mother mentioned how proud she was of both her daughters. She said it evenly, without comparison. Lena smiled. I nodded. The moment passed quietly, but it lingered with me long after. Balance. It had taken years, but it had arrived. I don't pretend that favoritism didn't leave marks. It did. It shaped how I approach trust, how I guard my energy, how I choose my battles. But it also gave me something invaluable: self-reliance rooted in self-respect. I learned early that if I wanted to be seen, I had to see myself first. Sometimes I think back to graduation day, not with longing, but with gratitude. Not because my parents were forced to confront their choices, but because I was finally free from waiting. That moment closed a chapter I didn't even realize was still open. If you're listening to this and you feel overlooked, unsupported, or quietly dismissed, I want you to know something. Your effort matters, even when it's invisible. Your resilience is real, even when it's unacknowledged. And your moment doesn't need witnesses to be valid. There will come a day when the weight you carried alone becomes the strength that sets you apart. when the silence you endured becomes the proof that you never needed permission to succeed. And when that day comes, whether it's public or private, loud or quiet, it will be enough. Because the truth is, the strongest foundations are built where no one is watching.
As the years moved forward, I began to see my story not as a wound, but as a framework, something that had shaped how I moved through the world, how I responded to unfairness, how I chose compassion without losing myself. The pain didn't vanish, it transformed. It became perspective. And perspective, when handled carefully, can be powerful. I noticed it most when new challenges appeared, when projects at work became overwhelming, when expectations grew heavier, when mistakes happened and the familiar voice of self-doubt tried to return. This time, I didn't collapse inward. I addressed problems directly. I asked for what I needed. I trusted that needing support didn't make me weak, it made me human. That shift alone felt like breaking a generational pattern. My parents continued their slow, imperfect evolution. They asked about my life more sincerely now. They remembered details. They followed up. It wasn't performative. It was effort. And I allowed myself to receive it without suspicion, without guarding every interaction. Trust, I learned, can be rebuilt in fragments. One afternoon, my mother and I went for a walk together. The neighborhood was quiet, sunlight filtering through the trees. She spoke first. "I've been thinking a lot about how we raised you girls," she said, "about the differences." I listened without interrupting. "I don't know why we assumed you'd always be fine," she continued. "You were so capable. We thought that meant you didn't need as much." I stopped walking and turned to her. "Being capable doesn't mean being okay," I said gently. She nodded, eyes glossy. "I know that now." That conversation didn't reopen old wounds. It softened them. It allowed us to meet each other where we were, not where we wished we had been. And for the first time, I felt like we were speaking as adults, not as parent and overlooked child. Lena and I took a trip together not long after that, just the two of us. It was unplanned, a last-minute decision that turned into something meaningful. We talked late into the night, sharing memories we had never compared before. She admitted she had always felt pressure to live up to the investment made in her. I admitted I had always felt pressure to prove I deserved one. We laughed at the irony. Two daughters shaped by the same parents, carrying different weights. On the drive home, Lena said something that stayed with me. "I admire you," she said, "not because you did it alone, but because you didn't let it make you bitter." I thought about that for a long time. Bitterness would have been easier. It would have justified my pain, but it would have also chained me to it. Choosing growth wasn't about being noble, it was about being free. I began to write more, sharing parts of my journey in essays and talks. People reached out, telling me they saw themselves in my story. The overlooked sibling, the self-funded dreamer, the quiet achiever. I realized then that my experience wasn't rare, it was just rarely spoken about, and sometimes naming something gives others permission to heal too. At a small speaking event, a man approached me afterward, tears in his eyes. He said, "My parents paid for my brother's education, not mine. I thought I was alone." "You're not," I told him, and I meant it. The more I shared, the more I understood that my story wasn't about revenge or recognition. It was about agency, about deciding who I would be regardless of circumstances, about learning that fairness isn't always given, but dignity can always be claimed. My parents attended one of my talks unexpectedly. I saw them in the back of the room, sitting quietly, listening. Afterward, my father hugged me longer than usual. "You turned something hard into something good," he said. I nodded. I had to. That night, I thought again about graduation day. about the dean's voice cutting through the air, about the collective intake of breath when my name was called. That moment was powerful, yes, but it was only a chapter. The real story continued in quieter victories, in conversations healed, in boundaries set, in confidence earned daily. If you're still waiting for your moment, still carrying something heavy without acknowledgement, I want you to hear this clearly. Your worth isn't delayed, your growth isn't invisible, and your story doesn't end where others failed you. Sometimes the most powerful redemption isn't public at all. It's the way you stand differently afterward, the way you speak your truth calmly, the way you build a life that no longer revolves around proving anything. That's where real success lives.
By the time I reached my 30s, I had learned something that younger me never could have imagined. Peace doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, often unnoticed, until one day you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. You're just living. That realization came to me on an ordinary morning, standing in my kitchen, coffee cooling on the counter, sunlight warming the floor. There was no tension in my chest, no rehearsal of old conversations in my mind, just stillness. That kind of peace had been hard-won. It grew from boundaries I once felt guilty for setting, from choices I once feared would disappoint others. I had learned that protecting my energy wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And surprisingly, the people who truly cared adapted. My parents had adapted too, in their own imperfect way. They no longer compared Lena and me, at least not out loud. They asked before assuming. They listened without rushing to fix or minimize. It wasn't flawless, but it was real. And real progress, I learned, doesn't look like transformation. It looks like consistency. One afternoon, my mother called me, her voice softer than usual. "I've been telling a friend about you," she said, "about how you put yourself through school, about how hard you worked." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because it hurt, but because it surprised me. "What did you say?" I asked. "That I wish I had seen it sooner," she replied. There it was. Not a full apology, not a dramatic confession, but acknowledgement, finally spoken without prompting. It didn't erase the past, but it eased something I didn't realize I was still holding. I thanked her, and we sat in silence for a few seconds before hanging up. It was enough. Lena and I had settled into an easy rhythm. We celebrated each other without competition. When she succeeded, I felt genuine pride. When I succeeded, she showed up. We had rewritten our relationship, not by pretending the past didn't exist, but by refusing to let it define us. That choice belonged to both of us. I found myself reflecting more often on the concept of fairness. Growing up, I believed fairness meant equal treatment. Now I understood it differently. Fairness is about intention, about awareness, about adjusting when you realize the weight isn't evenly distributed. My parents hadn't understood that then. They did now, at least more than before. At work, I moved into a leadership role. Managing others forced me to confront my own habits, especially the tendency to overfunction. I caught myself assuming some team members could handle more simply because they appeared capable. Each time I paused, I asked questions, I checked in. I refused to repeat the patterns that had once shaped me. One evening, a junior colleague thanked me for noticing her effort. She said, "Most people don't." I smiled. "I know," I replied. Mentorship became a quiet passion of mine. I gravitated toward those who worked hard without drawing attention to themselves. I advocated for them in rooms they weren't invited into yet. In doing so, I healed something deep inside me. I became the presence I once needed. As time passed, my parents and I developed new traditions: weekly calls, shared meals, honest conversations. They weren't perfect, but they were intentional, and intention, I learned, can rebuild what neglect once eroded. On the anniversary of my valedictorian speech, I listened to a recording of it for years in the making. I heard the steadiness in my voice, the clarity of my message. I wasn't angry, I wasn't pleading, I was grounded. That realization made me smile. Even then, before all the healing, I had known who I was becoming. If you're listening and wondering whether it ever stops hurting, the answer is yes, but not all at once. Pain fades in layers. Each boundary, each honest conversation, each moment of self-trust peels another layer away. One day, you wake up and realize the story no longer defines you, it informs you. My parents didn't change overnight, neither did I, but together we learned something valuable. Love doesn't excuse harm, but it can grow when harm is acknowledged. And even when acknowledgement comes late, it still matters. I no longer measure my success by who supported me. I measure it by who I've become. And that version of me, the one who stood at that podium, steady and unafraid, still guides me forward.
As I look back now, the story doesn't feel like a single arc with a clean beginning and end. It feels more like a series of small turns, each one quietly redirecting me toward a life that feels honest. The favoritism, the silence, the struggle, none of it vanished, but none of it owns me anymore either. It became context, not destiny. There was a moment not long ago when my parents and I sat together at a family gathering watching old home videos. Grainy footage flickered across the screen, birthday candles, school plays, holidays long past. I watched myself in those clips, quiet, observant, often just outside the frame. It stirred something gentle in me, not sadness, but compassion, for that child, for the parents who didn't know what they were missing, for all of us doing the best we could with what we understood at the time. My father paused the video suddenly. "You are always so serious," he said softly. "I wish I had asked you more questions." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're asking now," I replied. That's what healing looked like for us, not rewriting the past, but engaging differently with the present. At work, my career continued to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was invited to lead a long-term project, one that required trust, vision, and patience. It felt fitting. I had built my life the same way, slowly, intentionally, without shortcuts. Each decision reflected the values forged during those early years of independence. During a team retreat, we were asked to share a formative experience. When my turn came, I spoke briefly about putting myself through college. I didn't mention favoritism. I didn't need to. The room was quiet when I finished, and afterwards several colleagues thanked me for my honesty. I realized then that vulnerability, when shared calmly, creates connection, not pity. Lena and I began talking about the future more openly, about families, about what we wanted to pass on and what we wanted to leave behind. "I don't ever want my kids to feel compared," she said one evening, "or invisible." "Me neither," I agreed. We both knew where that resolve came from. My parents, too, seemed to be reflecting more. They asked about my childhood memories. They listened without defensiveness. Sometimes they apologized in small ways, a comment here, an admission there. Each one felt like a stitch closing an old wound. Not perfectly, but enough. One afternoon, my mother handed me a small envelope. Inside was a check. "We know it's late," she said, "but we wanted to contribute to what you've built." I looked at it for a long moment before handing it back. "I appreciate the thought," I said gently, "but I don't need it." She nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about choice, and this time the choice was mine. I used to think closure required a dramatic moment, a confrontation, an apology, a confession. Now I know better. Closure is quieter. It's the moment you stop wishing things had been different and start appreciating who you've become because they weren't. If you're still carrying the weight of being overlooked, let me tell you this. Your story doesn't end with recognition. Recognition is just one moment. Growth is a lifetime. And the strength you're building right now, unseen and uncelebrated, will shape you in ways you don't understand. When the dean called my name, it wasn't the beginning of my redemption. It was a reflection of everything that had already happened in silence. The late nights, the sacrifices, the belief I built when no one else did. That moment didn't make me strong. It revealed that I already was. Today, when I think about my parents paying for my sister's college and not mine, I no longer feel the sting I once did. I see it as part of a larger story, one that taught me self-trust, resilience, and the power of quiet perseverance. Lessons I carry with me into every room, every relationship, every challenge. And if there's one truth I hope stays with you after hearing my story, it's this. You don't need equal treatment to build an extraordinary life. You need courage. You need consistency. And most of all, you need the willingness to stand by yourself when no one else does. Everything else will follow.
There comes a point in every long journey when you stop looking back to measure how far you've come and start looking forward to decide how you want to live. For me, that point arrived quietly, without ceremony. It came on an evening when I declined an invitation I would have once accepted out of obligation. I didn't offer an excuse. I didn't feel guilty. I simply chose rest. That was when I understood how deeply my relationship with myself had changed. For most of my life, I had been shaped by reaction. I reacted to neglect by overachieving. I reacted to silence by becoming smaller. I reacted to unfairness by enduring it quietly. But now, I was acting with intention. I chose where to place my energy. I chose who had access to me. I chose when to speak and when to stay silent, not because I felt powerless, but because I felt secure. My parents noticed the shift too. They no longer expected immediate availability from me. When I said I was busy, they accepted it. When I set boundaries, they respected them. That respect didn't come from fear of losing me. It came from understanding that I was no longer a child, adjusting myself to fit their comfort. One evening, during a family dinner, my father raised a glass and said, "I want to thank both my daughters for teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn." It wasn't a perfect apology, it wasn't specific, but it was sincere, and I realized then that people grow at different speeds. Some lessons take decades. What matters is whether they're finally willing to learn. Lena smiled at me across the table. There was no rivalry in her eyes, no comparison, just warmth, the kind that comes from mutual respect. Our relationship had matured into something steady, something honest. We didn't compete for space anymore. We shared it. I began to notice how often my stories surfaced in unexpected moments. A coworker confiding in me, a neighbor sharing a struggle, a distant relative asking how I stayed so grounded. Each time, I didn't present myself as someone who had overcome something. I presented myself as someone who had adapted, reflected, and chosen differently. That distinction mattered. There were still hard days, days when old memories surfaced without warning, days when I wondered how things might have been if support had been equal from the start. But those thoughts no longer controlled me. They passed through like weather, noticed, acknowledged, then gone. I learned that grief doesn't disappear just because healing begins. It softens. It loses its edge. It becomes part of the landscape rather than the storm. At work, I was asked to mentor a group of new hires. During our first session, I told them something I wish someone had told me earlier. Don't confuse being capable with being unbreakable. You're allowed to ask for support. The room was quiet after that. I could see recognition in their eyes. I knew then that my experiences, once painful, once lonely, had become useful. They had purpose beyond me. My parents and I took a trip together later that year. Nothing extravagant, just a few days away. It was the first time I didn't feel like I was playing a role. I didn't perform gratitude. I didn't manage emotions. I simply existed, and they met me where I was. On the last night of that trip, my mother said, almost to herself, "I wish we had trusted you more." I looked at the horizon, the sky deepening into evening. "I trusted myself," I said quietly. "That made the difference." She nodded, tears gathering, but she didn't need to. Some truths don't require response. As I prepare for the next chapter of my life, whatever it may bring, I carry my story with me, not as a burden, but as a compass. It reminds me where I came from. It reminds me what I'm capable of. And it reminds me never to overlook quiet strength, especially in others. If you're listening and still waiting for your moment, still hoping someone will finally see how hard you've tried, I want you to hear this clearly. Your life does not pause until validation arrives. You are allowed to move forward now. You are allowed to choose yourself now. Because the most powerful transformation isn't the one that happens on a stage under bright lights with everyone watching. It's the one that happens slowly, privately, when you decide that your worth no longer depends on being chosen. That decision will carry you further than any applause ever could.
When I think about how this story truly ends, I realize it doesn't end with a single sentence or moment. It ends in the way I live now, in the way my shoulders no longer tense when my phone rings, in the way I don't rehearse conversations in my head before having them, in the way I trust myself enough to walk away from spaces that feel small. The ending isn't dramatic, it's peaceful, and peace, after everything, feels like the greatest victory of all. There was a day not long ago when I stood in front of a mirror and caught my own reflection unexpectedly, not rushing, not bracing, just standing there. And I recognized myself fully, not as the overlooked child, not as the struggling student, not even as the valedictorian, but as a woman who had built her life deliberately, a woman who knew her value without needing to explain it. My parents and I are in a different place now. We laugh more easily. We talk more honestly. The air between us isn't thick with unspoken things anymore. They don't try to overcorrect the past, and I don't hold it over them. We've accepted what was, learned from it, and chosen to do better with what remains. That doesn't mean everything is perfect. It means it's real. Lena and I have grown into something solid and steady. There's no shadow between us now, no competition, no quiet comparisons, just two sisters who understand each other more clearly than ever before. We check in, we show up, we support each other without keeping score. And that alone feels like rewriting a small part of history. Sometimes people still ask about that graduation day, about how it felt when the dean called my name. I tell them the truth. It was powerful, it was validating, but it wasn't the most important moment of my life. The most important moments were the ones no one saw, the nights I chose not to quit, the mornings I showed up exhausted but determined, the times I believed in myself when it would have been easier not to. That's the part of the story I hope you hear most clearly. If you grew up feeling less chosen, less supported, less seen, please understand this. Your life is not a reaction to someone else's neglect. It is a creation of your own persistence. You don't need to wait for fairness to appear before you begin living fully. You don't need approval to pursue excellence, and you don't need anyone's permission to become who you already are. The truth is, my parents paying for my sister's college but not mine didn't break me, it shaped me. It forced me to find strength where I didn't know it existed. It taught me discipline, empathy, and self-trust, lessons I carry into every part of my life now. When I stood on that stage as valedictorian, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. Right for believing I could do this, right for trusting my own resilience, right for continuing forward even when the road felt lonely. And now, as I move through the world, I carry that knowledge quietly. I don't announce it, I don't defend it, I simply live it, with confidence, with calm, with clarity. So if you're still in the middle of your story, still tired, still unseen, still pushing forward, I want you to remember this ending, not because it promises applause, but because it promises something better: self-respect, self-trust, and a life built on your own terms. Sometimes the dean doesn't call your name right away. Sometimes no one does. But if you keep going, if you stay true to yourself, one day you'll realize you don't need your name called at all. You already answered.